have Genesis chapter 18 open, and I'm going to start off by saying that if you were to Google films with angels and look at the incredible list of films that Hollywood and other filmmaking areas have come up with over the years, you come up with a huge list of films. They cover the decades, absolutely loads of them. Everyone from Ewan McGregor to John Travolta and even Nicolas Cage, who's got to be the least angelic-looking man there ever has been, have portrayed angels. And tragically, I found by looking at this list of films that have the subject of angels in them, that in 1990, they made a sequel to the film from 1946, It's a Wonderful Life. They made a film called Clarence. Now, I don't know about you, that's a brilliant film. I've never seen this film, but just looking at that film has got to stink, hasn't it? That film has got to be one of the worst things ever. The world has a bit of a fascination with angels, and if you were to look at TV series as well, and this will date some of us in the room, there even used to be a TV show called Highway to Heaven. Anyone remember that? It was awful, wasn't it? Or was it just me that thought it was awful as a boy growing up in the 1980s? That was about a recently dead man who'd been sent back to earth as an angel. So like Greg said last week, it's fair to say people have a bit of a fascination with angels and the possibility that they might well meet with them. And in our reading, we saw that. We saw some people, some human beings, meeting some angelic figures and interacting with them. They entertained them. They gave them food. In the next chapter, they're even protected by them. And if you do read the next chapter, we get to see the angels doing some pretty impressive stuff. And if tonight I was going to follow where maybe that theme would go, I would be talking about the possibility of how Victor has said, that maybe angels are all around us and we can encounter them, and maybe they can even act in the same way that we see in the book of Genesis. And if you were to go to the book of Hebrews, it would say that we should be hospitable people because by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without even knowing it. I'm going to try and circle back there at the end, but I'm going to confess something. In preparation for tonight, I just couldn't get another thought out of my head. And the thought was this: yeah, it's really great that Abraham and Sarah put on a meal for some people and two of them are angels. And in chapter 19, it's really intriguing how Lot and his family end up being protected by angels and giving them a meal as well. And wow, wouldn't it be great if that happens? Because it would be amazing if something like that happened in our lives. But I couldn't get past something which I found a bit more awe-inspiring. Because when you look at the conversation between one of these characters and Abraham and Sarah, one of these visitors is God. God's talking to them. It felt like if I was to say, yeah, you can meet angels, I'd kind of be missing the point. So if you can forgive me, I'm going somewhere else tonight. I think Victor's covered everything that I would have probably have said, and he's done it a lot shorter than I would have done as well. So thank you, Victor. Yeah, you might meet angels, but maybe meeting with God is a little bit more exciting. I don't know. Because what we see in this encounter with Abraham and Sarah and the angels is, to start with, they don't realize who it is that they're talking to. They meet with God, and God appears like a person. They meet with God, and they survive the encounter. That's an interesting one, which I still can't work out. They meet with God, and they're forever changed. So that's where I'm going to spend most of my time. And if you're disappointed about that, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry at the same time, because I got quite excited about the other part of the story. So, Genesis chapter 18. Where do we begin? We begin with Abraham and Sarah in the middle of the day meeting three figures just at this stage, three men. And we know, if we've read Genesis 18, we know more than they do at the start of this encounter. We know that the Lord has appeared to Abraham. God has shown up. But Abraham doesn't know it at this point. He doesn't know it. But we do get to see how he and his wife pick up on it and how it changes them. So we're going to picture the scene. It's midday. It's hot. Abraham is sitting in the door of his tent. Maybe he's shielding himself from the heat of the day. And I don't know about you, for me, that's siesta time. That's when I would be thinking, it's time for a nap. It's hot and you're in a tent. What else have you got to do? And I think they get a hint that maybe that's what Abraham's doing, because they just suddenly take him by surprise. These three people that turn up, he hasn't seen them coming. But suddenly they're there. And even in what happens next, we don't have any inkling that he's clocked who they are. Because even though he entertains them, even though he puts on a meal, that's simply what you did in their culture. If you saw a stranger, you entertained them. You gave them food, you gave them water, you looked after them. And one thing we can say for certain is Abraham is an awesome host. That's one thing you can take away from this. So he's caught by surprise, and every single thing that he does, he's rushing and he's hurrying to get it done. So he rushes to them, he bows, and he offers them his hospitality. He says, let me get some water so I can wash your feet. He says, if I found favor with you, stay with me and let me get you something to eat. He actually says to them, let me get you just a little morsel to eat. Little morsel to eat. Just a little something, and then you can be refreshed and you can go on your way. And then he puts on the best meal that he can possibly do in a short time. So he goes to his wife Sarah and he says, get, 3 seahs. Now, that probably doesn't mean much to us. When you look at the footnote, you get to see just how much flour he tells Sarah to make into bread. So 16 kilos. For those of you who don't do kilos, 2.5 stones worth of flour. And he says, make some bread out of that. Just a morsel, just 2.5 stones worth of flour. And I can kind of imagine Sarah at this point, after Abraham's left, muttering to herself, what am I, a bakery? I can imagine this was not a pleasant thing for her to be told. The quantity and the quality of the food that Abraham will put in front of people goes off the scale. So he gets the finest possible flour. He gives them beef. Oh, I love beef. He goes and gets a choice calf, the very best that he's got, because that's what he wants to give to his guests. He serves it with yogurt and milk. Now, that's not a strange Heston Blumenthal moment. That's quite simply, in their world, is a banquet. He's putting on for these 3 guests the best meal that he possibly can. And really, just in passing, there's a glimmer for us about what it means to be hospitable. Make people feel like it's no trouble at all, and then do the best you can in the time you've got to honor them and glorify God. I think that's one of the things you can take from this. Now, that doesn't mean roast beef every time. If I come round, it means roast beef, but that's... but it probably talks about your attitude. So if you're having people round, make them feel really welcome. Really, really welcome. And it could be a pizza delivered with the right heart is exactly what, in line with what Abraham's doing. That's just a little aside, but I think that's kind of where the hospitality bit goes. He makes them feel honored, he makes them feel welcome, and then he stands under a tree ready to serve them a little bit more while they're eating. And then, something which would have been really, really normal in their world starts to get a little bit strange, because the tone of this meal changes a little bit. It's no longer about Abraham running around trying to do the greatest meal that he possibly can in the shortest amount of time. It's about one of his guests. And it's a really specific guest. It's God that we now start to look at. What's really interesting is, if you look at the passage up to verse 10, these 3 strangers that have appeared, they seem to speak in unison. So there's nothing distinctive about any of them to start with. Verse 5, when he says, come and stay with me, let me wash your feet, they all say, very well, do as you say. They all sit down, they all eat. The first glimmer of something a little bit strange is in verse 9. Suddenly, they say, where's Sarah? Where's Sarah? How do they know her name? She's been in the tent the whole time. Now, Abraham might have told them that my wife is called Sarah, but that starts to change the tone of the encounter, because it's no longer about Abraham and Sarah serving their guests. It's about God serving them. It's about God changing them. And in particular, he's changing Sarah in this story. That's who he's dealing with. And I was so taken by how he's changing Sarah, that's why I've kind of diverted from the angels. Up until this point, Sarah's been in the background. She's made a ton of bread. But she's not been at the front of the house serving the guests. She's been out the back working and probably cleaning up whatever you have to clean up after you've made that much bread. But like any good eavesdropper, she's listening to what's going on, and she's heard them mention her name. She's heard them say, "Where's Sarah?" So she's stopped whatever she's doing. She's come to the tent where no one can see her, and she is listening. Why are these men talking about me? Why am I suddenly the topic of conversation? What's going on here? And then she hears one voice carry through the tent, and it hits her ears, because this voice says, "I will surely return to you next year at this time, and Sarah will have a son." That's what happens. God says, "I'm going to return, and Sarah's going to have a son." And I think verses 10 and 11, when we look at these, they kind of give us a moment where the scene just sits silently for a moment. It's almost as if that character has said it and then gives us a moment to take in the significance of what's been said. We're again reminded of where Sarah is. She's out of eyesight, but she's listening. And then we get driven home to us exactly how significant it is for this person to say that about her. Because what does it say? It says that Abraham and Sarah are very old, and Sarah is beyond the age of childbearing. If we're going to get into our minds just how incredible it is what this person says, then this next picture has to embed itself in your mind. I think I've got a picture of a couple of Indian people, is that right? Yeah. This is something that happened a year or so ago. A couple in their 70s in India had a baby. They had a baby. Science had to get involved to help them have this baby, but they have a child. And this is the kind of picture we have got going on here. It's two people in their 90s being told, this time next year, this tent, which has been a place of hospitality, is going to have the carnage of nappies and broken sleep. Two people in their 90s are being told, you are going to have a baby. And to drive it home, we get told, as you would expect for a 90-year-old, Sarah's beyond childbearing age. Her body is naturally beyond the possibility. Now, for Abraham, he's heard all this before. So some 13 years previously, God has told him he's going to have a son, and he's going to have a son through Sarah. So he remembers this promise, but maybe for Sarah this is new information, or maybe it's something that she's just heard secondhand. But really, when the Lord says, I'm going to return this time next year and you're going to have a son, the message is for the old woman eavesdropping in the tent behind. Because it doesn't seem like she believes it. If Abraham's told her this, it seems like she does not believe a word of it. Because when you look at verse 12, that's when you get a window into Sarah's heart, and you get a window into Abraham and Sarah's relationship. Because Sarah sees the human impossibility for what it is. She laughs and she thinks to herself, after I'm worn out, so after I'm like a rag, a garment that's seen better days, after I'm ready to be thrown away, and after my husband is old and well past his peak in every possible connotation of that word, am I now going to have this pleasure? That's what she says. And let's be honest, we probably read that word pleasure and we think that she is saying, am I now going to have the joy of having a child? And we probably think it gets exhausted by that. Yes, that is definitely part of it, but sometimes the Bible uses words which when you look at them and you find out what they mean, there's kind of another layer to it as well. So she literally says, am I now being old and worn out and with a decrepit husband, am I about to have this delicacy? Am I about to have this really precious thing? And she uses a word, and Bible translators, they love sanitizing things. It's a word which has connotations of sexual pleasure. That's the word that she uses. So it's as if she is saying, are we, at our age, going to start behaving like newlyweds? That's almost what she's saying. That is what she is laughing at. See, her laugh is not at the impossibility of having a child. Part of it is at the possibility of being intimate with her husband again. That's part of what's going on. It's a laugh of bitterness. It's a laugh of pain. Because probably for a very long time, judging by that statement, that part of their relationship has gone. It's gone. And in a society where a woman's worth was found in, could she produce heirs for her husband? Sarah couldn't. Sarah hadn't been able to. And then she hears this. She hasn't been able to provide Abraham with a son. And this bitterness has been there for a while. So if you flick back just a couple of chapters to chapter 16, we see how this has played out some years earlier. This is 13 years earlier. So at the start of chapter 16, now Sarai, or who will become Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build my family through her." She gets her slave to perform that role. And then to drive the stake into Sarah's heart even more, Hagar conceives. That's got to be even worse for her. And Hagar rubs it in Sarah's face. It's almost as if she's saying, "Look at me, I'm pregnant, something you could never, ever be." And Sarah hates it. And so when she laughs some 13 years later, she's laughing out of her pain. She's laughing out of her bitterness. It's all too ridiculous. It's all too ridiculous. It's biologically impossible. And relationally with her husband, that has been off the agenda for some time. It's too late. It's too late. That's how she sees things. But it's not. It's not. And it seems by this stage, this conversation has drawn Sarah out of the tent, because the Lord speaks to Abraham and says, "Why did she laugh? Why did she laugh?" He knows what was going on in Sarah's mind when she was eavesdropping in a tent. And then God says some really great words in verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And that is a great moment to pause. Just let that run over your mind. Is anything too hard for the Lord? In the face of decades of sadness and damage and bitterness, in the face of all the damage which might have happened to Abraham and Sarah's relationship, God is saying to Sarah, "Is changing this too hard for me? Is changing this too difficult for me?" It's almost like he's saying, "Is me giving back to you your marriage in all of its fullness and giving you a child too difficult for me?" And the implied answer is no. No. This is not too difficult for God. He can take the deepest pain of your life and not just compensate for it. He can redeem it and he can transform it. So actually the pain of the past is part of the beauty of what he does. So right here and right now, I hope you can see why I couldn't get passionate about the idea that you might bump into an angel somewhere, because this just seems far more exciting to me. We have a God who can take our deepest bitterness, our deepest disappointments, our relationship disharmony, and he can transform it into beauty. That's an amazing thing. And so what I would like you to do at this moment is this. Look at your deepest sadness. Whatever it is right now, whatever your deepest sadness is right now, and hear God saying to you, "I can bring joy back to you. I can bring joy back." Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get exactly what you want. Doesn't mean he's going to necessarily provide to every person who wants a child, a child. It doesn't mean that to everyone who wants a wife or a husband, they're necessarily going to get it. But he does say that if we trust in him and if we trust in his promises, he turns bitterness into hope. That's what he does. He turns worthlessness into grace. He turns misery into joy. That is what our God does. In fact, what I love about what God says when he speaks to Sarah is this, is that he doesn't actually say, is anything too hard for the Lord? He actually says, is anything too wonderful? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Again, it's just been slightly obscured. Our translators have hidden that. And for me, for him to say, is anything too wonderful for the Lord, to quote a film which will be lost on some of you, that turns it up to 11. That makes it just seem so much better than saying, is anything too hard? It's not just that our God can do hard and difficult things. He can do wonderful things, absolutely wonderful things. And so this little back and forth between God and Abraham and Sarah ends with God saying to them, I'm coming back this time next year, and Sarah, you're going to have a child. You're going to have your husband back. You're going to have a son. In a world where children are your status and your worth, you'll have it. All of that bitterness from the past is going to be dealt with. And even if you still can't believe it right now, Sarah, let's see in a year. And let's see in a year. Let's flick over. So flick over to chapter 21. And see whether, like me, you think Sarah seems a little bit different here. So I'm going to read the first few verses. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant. They didn't stay old and decrepit, apparently, and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. I think she's different. She feels different to me. She's become pregnant, so that's relationship back for certain. Her son is given a name which means he laughs. But this doesn't seem to be a laugh of bitterness anymore. This is a laugh of absolute joy. Sarah is laughing at just what a wonderful thing God has been able to do. She's got her life back. She's got her status back. God has been gracious to her. And it's all through a miracle baby. God can do that. God can do that for absolutely everyone in the room. If you feel like your life is worthless, it can be transformed. Nothing is too difficult for God to change it. No one is ever beyond his reach. No one's ever beyond his care. No one is ever too far gone or too worn out or too useless or too whatever you would add on to that to make yourself feel depressed. No one and nothing is too wonderful for God not to change it. That should fuel our compassion for people. That should empower our prayers for people. If we have a God for whom nothing is too hard and nothing is too wonderful, we should pray to him with a bit of excitement as to what he might do. It should give us hope when life is tough and we can't see what God is doing. And like I said this morning, the way this comes across time to us is we have to look down the family tree again, because the promise given to Abraham was that one day one of your descendants is going to be the savior of the world. This morning we saw how the woman no one wanted called Leah was the one God used to bring his savior to the world. And Sarah is part of that promise as well. So her son Isaac is the father of Jacob, who has the two wives that cause him all the trouble. But if we just look at Sarah's miracle son, we kind of miss the point. We have to look at another miracle baby to see how this comes across to us, because it goes all through the generations until yet again there is another woman who has another encounter with an angel and is told about another impossible son that she's about to have. And for her, it's not that her and her husband have drifted apart, it's they have never been together to start with. So it's impossible in a whole different way. And yet she too has a baby. She has a baby that people marvel about at his birth. And he's a life-changing, life-altering, destiny-transforming baby. He becomes a man who gives hope to the hopeless, who reaches out to the nobodies, who reaches out to the outcasts, and he comes to give them life at the cost of his own. When Jesus was presented as a baby at the temple, an old man picked him up and said, "This child is going to cause some people to rise and some people to fall. He's going to be spoken against." And then he said, "And Mary, you're going to be hurt by looking at him because he's going to be hurt." Back in Genesis 18, God said to Abraham and Sarah, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" And I want to just close by asking the same question for you. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? What's more difficult for God to do? Is it more difficult for God to give a woman in her 90s a baby, or is it more difficult for him to save you? It's an easy question to answer. It's much easier to give an old woman a child. We can do that with technology, as we saw with that couple in India who, my goodness, they've got some sleepless nights ahead of them. We can give old people a baby, but becoming one of God's family takes nothing short of God himself becoming one of us, becoming a miracle child, and laying his life down for us. That's more difficult, that's more wonderful. God's dealings with Sarah transformed bitterness into joy, misery into delight, meaninglessness into identity. And he can do exactly the same with any one of us. So I hope you can understand why I couldn't get so excited about the fact that we might bump into an angel. As awesome as that might be, and I don't want you to discount the possibility, because you might. But neither do I want you to feel disappointed that it might not happen, because actually something much, much better is right there in the passage for us. God has entered history to save you and to give your life meaning. He has given his miracle child for you. And there's an invitation, I think, to be as full of wonder as Sarah and Abraham were when they saw their child being born. So I want to encourage you to look at Jesus once again. He comes for hopeless sinners like you and me. And so if tonight you're feeling meaningless, if you're feeling bitter, if you're feeling in pain, if there's something that just looks too hard, look at that story again. Look at the life of Jesus and let him convince you that nothing is too hard, nothing is too wonderful for him to transform a life of bitterness to a life of joy. So take that into tomorrow. That's what our God can do. Let's pray. Father God, we want to thank you for the miracle child that Abraham and Sarah had. It's an incredible story of how you transformed their relationship and brought a nation out of their family, but it points to a much more miraculous birth, the birth of your Son, where the God who created the entire universe stepped into history in order to save us. That is a miracle birth which should make us laugh. That's a miracle birth that we should look at and think, is anything too wonderful for God? And it's a birth which should give us confidence. Confidence in the God who loves us and who wants to save us, but also confidence that you can you can change our deepest pains and our greatest difficulties into something joyful. And so tonight, we put them in front of you. And they're probably different all around the room. It could be that you're not going to answer them quickly. It took until Sarah was in her 90s before you gave her a child. It could be you take your time with our difficulties, but nothing is too hard for you, and nothing is too wonderful either. So we lay them before you, and we ask that you will hear our prayer. And then we ask that you'll give us the patience to trust that you will do what's right. Help us in the week ahead, Lord. Help us to be amazed once again at what you've done for us. You came to save us. Help us to be amazed that you would come and you would save people like us. And we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.